Good evening. My name is Don Smith. I'm the Associate Head of School here at Albuquerque Academy, and we're extraordinarily pleased to have you here for such an interesting talk by Drs. Quinn, Richardson, and Shuttlesworth. We are wrapping up the Community Academy for almost the school year. We have one more performance, a musical performance, but we're very thrilled to be able to partner when we can with UNM and have such events as this for the public. You can go to the website www.aa.edu, and there's a community button, and then on the community button there's a Community Academy button. You can see what's happening, you can get on the emailing list, or you can sign up in a registration sheet that's out in the lobby as well. We're exceptionally pleased to have these folks here tonight, and for any number of different reasons. Given this crowd, I'm sure any number of you are familiar with David Eagleman and the work he has done and the books he's written in his PBS series. David is an alum, class of '89. I had the great pleasure of teaching him. To be perfectly honest with you, we just wanted to have him survive. Which just goes to show that there's no predicting. He was a wonderful kid. He was as funny and as natural as he comes across, and still is. But we're very, very proud of David. It's my pleasure to begin the evening by introducing Dr. Barry Ramo. And if he needs an introduction, Dr. Ramo is a cardiologist and the founder of the New Mexico Heart Institute. He has had a long and rewarding relationship with the University of New Mexico Medical School, where he teaches. He's also a clinical professor of medicine and emergency medicine at the medical school, as well as a consulting professor of medicine at the Duke University School of Medicine. Dr. Ramo developed the Project Heart Start program, which has helped save many lives throughout New Mexico. He's been the medical editor at GOV-TV for 25 years and has written health columns for the Albuquerque Journal. More importantly for us, he's also the parent of two alums. I knew them both well. They were great, great kids. And without any further ado, Dr. Ramo.
Well, good evening. It is really exciting for me to see this big crowd, because I thought about it. I said, why would so many people come tonight? Then I realized there's really nothing on television to watch. Only the future of our country and the Supreme Court, but other than there's that. When I started cardiology, I would see patients brought into my office who had had a heart attack, who were in a wheelchair, and the treatment for heart attacks at that time was to put people to bed for 6 weeks and then never let them do anything for the rest of their lives. Over the subsequent years, we have had such a dramatic change in the way that patients with heart disease are treated. We repair them, they recover, their lives are normal. I have patients in my practice who've had heart attacks 40 years ago who are normal. If I were going to go into medicine right now, I would go into the field of neuroscience, because I think that is where it is at. And I am sure that the reason you are here tonight is for the same reason that I'm here, is that you are really curious and want to be on the forefront to see what brain research is like at our university. The first thing I want to say is that we have a Center for Brain Recovery and Repair. Think of that. Brain recovery and repair. That's not something you think about together. You think about Parkinson's disease, you think about Alzheimer's disease, you think about traumatic brain injury. What we're talking about and what they'll be talking about is something that's really foreign to many people. The idea that the brain has the plasticity, the resilience to recover, function in a way that is meaningful and the quality of life is enhanced. So what you're going to hear tonight, first from Dr. Bill Shuttlesworth, who is a superstar person at our university and is the head of the Center for Brain Recovery and Repair. He has written numerous papers, worked in the field for 30 years. He's also the director of the Brain and Behavioral Health Center at the University of New Mexico. But what I want everybody to understand is that we have in New Mexico a world-class program. We are now in a situation where we can say very proudly that the university has among many world-class events. So I'm very pleased to introduce him, but first I want to introduce the other two speakers. And Dr. Jessica Richardson is a newly arrived assistant professor in the area of speech and hearing at the University of New Mexico on the main campus. Her area and the research that she did before she came here was seminal research dealing with the idea of recovering speech in patients who can no longer speak. And so she's working as part of this recovery and repair unit and is one of the team of 150 people working on this multidisciplinary problem. And the final doctor I'm going to introduce is also one of the stars at the university in the Department of Psychiatry. Dr. Devin Quinn is a psychiatrist specialized in psychosomatic medicine. And many of you might think of psychosomatic medicine as a bunch of people with, make-up diseases, et cetera. What he's going to talk to you about is the fact is that the emotional trauma that all of us experience and sometimes in our life can have the same devastating effects that we see when the brain is injured from trauma. So I first want to bring up Dr. Shuttleworth to come up and speak and tell us all about this, and then the subsequent speakers will follow, and after this we will have a lecture. Question and answer. I do want to point out one thing, because many of you have been reading in the newspaper about what's going on at the university. I want everyone to understand that what you're hearing about tonight in large part had to do with Dr. Paul Roth's incentive and stimulation and support of this program. So whatever you read in the paper, I really would dismiss from my mind, because first place, a lot of times it's distorted. But more importantly, Dr. Paul Roth gets a lot of credit for helping support the kind of 150 people in the phenomenal world-class program that we have. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Ramo, for that very kind introduction, and especially thank you to the Academy for hosting us here tonight, and we really appreciate the interest and support of the community for this event. So this is Brain Awareness Week, and you might be aware that this is a brain. This is a human brain, and some of you got to touch one of these in the theatre next door before the event tonight. But what we're going to do now is to look inside the brain for a few minutes. Look inside to the basic building blocks of brain to see how it's made up and how it works. If you zoom in and look inside the brain, what you find are the basic building blocks looking much like this. This is a basic brain cell, also called a neuron. And neuroscientists are those that study brain cells and how they work together to give us the rich function of brain. If you take a simplistic picture of brain, you can understand a little bit about what it does. This picture shows on the left-hand side where information comes into a brain cell. These little processes on the left, these little projections, take information in and also do computing on those inputs and integrate all those inputs and send out a signal along this long process and talk to many other neurons throughout your brain through processes of these terminals that actually do computing as well. So the individual building block of brain is actually like a little computer doing very complex integration and communication, not just a point-to-point transmission. You have a lot of these in your brain. This picture shows some of the complexity, but the numbers are what we're interested in right now. I'm here to tell you that there are about 80 to 100 billion individual nerve cells within your brains. 80 to 100 billion cells. And what's more, each of these cells communicates, makes connections with many other neurons. These connections are called synapses. Here's a picture of one of those types of connections. But each cell has upon it thousands of connections, up to about 10,000 connections with other neurons in the brain. So those number of connections give you a quadrillion or so connections in your entire brain. And if you theoretically calculated how many unique combinations of communication could occur between all those connections, you come up with a rather astonishing number. A number that is truly astronomical, a number of possible connections of communication in your brain that's larger than the number of particles in the universe. Kind of surprising. Brain Awareness Week, that's a fact. So if you think for a minute about what your brains can do, you can verifiably put yourself on the same stage as a supercomputer and beat it. The human brain is the most complex device in the universe, and it stacks up quite nicely with something like this, the IBM Sequoia supercomputer, which until quite recently was the winner in artificial intelligence processing. If you measure, obviously the supercomputer will beat you if you asked it to do a calculation. It can do that very quickly and very well, faster than the human brain. But if you ask, how is information transferred within the system? The human brain, on this gentleman standing here in the picture, beats the supercomputer by about 30 times the amount of processing that occurs within the human brain, within your human brain. Maybe in about 10 years the computers will catch up, but we're still ahead. So why do we have such complicated brains? Why do we have 100 billion little computers stacked up and working together in the brain? Because we don't just do calculations like a supercomputer. We do very complicated things that you might not be aware of. If you take something apparently relatively simple, like kicking a soccer ball, and think about what the brain is actually doing during this event, it's astonishing. At the bottom of the brain, at the very base, there's something called the brain stem, a stalk of neurons, a few million neurons sitting there that without you even thinking about it, in this primitive part of the brain, actually controlling everything that's occurring in your body during preparation for this kick, controlling your heart rate, your blood pressure, your breathing, your sweating, everything is controlled by your brain without you even thinking about it, and it does it on the fly and makes adaptations as it needs to. At the top of your brain, you have areas of the brain at the back for your visual cortex, which gives you this remarkable Technicolor, super high def, 3D projection of your world around you, constantly changing and adjusting for the fact that you're actually moving. It keeps it all stable for you. Quite remarkable. Billions of neurons, millions and billions of neurons doing all this stuff. And then at the top, you have part of your frontal cortex, might be involved in executive function, making decisions about when to kick, thinking back about who the goalie is, whether the goalie had an accident that you read about in the newspaper that makes you adjust your kick just a little bit. All of these things happening, adjusting on the fly, moment to moment, within milliseconds, to allow you to make that easy kick. So with that starting point, we're going to think a little bit right now about 3 myths about brain to help us think about what Dr. Ramos said about recovery and maintaining a healthy brain through the lifespan. The first big myth is a pretty common one. You might have heard it said that you only use 10% of your brain. Absolute bunk. Your brain is an absolutely exquisitely tuned organ, believe it or not. It might look like you're only using 10% of your brain, but 90% of your neurons aren't sitting around lying on lounge chairs just waiting to get kicked into action. Your brain does not do that. Your brain is actually a very hungry organ. Your brain is about 2% of your body weight, but it's about 20% of the energy consumption of your whole body. All of these little computers use a lot of energy. So it's very important for a brain not to waste energy. It's important for body survival that we haven't done that. So all of your neurons are working a lot of the time, even when you don't think you're doing anything at all. So these pictures are brain imaging pictures, which are becoming quite common now in the last decade or so. But it shows at the top parts of the brain that are working during processing of a visual stimulus, But what really excites me is what happens in the bottom picture. These bottom pictures, this row of pretty colors here, show blood flow to the brain when you're doing nothing at all. This is the resting state of the brain. And the brain is a very active place, consuming a lot of oxygen and glucose. And it's absolutely apparent from all brain imaging in the last couple of decades that we are using all of our brains almost all of the time. The second myth is very important for all of us here, except the 3 or 4 youngsters running around. This is an important myth for us to address tonight. The idea that your brain peaked during adolescence or sometime as a kid, and we're now in this inexorable slow decline towards being slow generally. Part of this is true. So the assumption that's generally taught is that as a toddler, during your early development, you're setting up all these connections between neurons, that there's this huge growth of neurons, huge growth of connections, and then everything gets set. And then afterwards, that's what you've got. And so as you approach, so part of that is true. So there is absolutely more neurons generally as a youngster, and you do actually have probably a few less nerve cells later in your life. But what you want to think about tonight is it's not the number of cells, but it's really about these connections. If you think about these connections, the big word for tonight is plasticity. These are not concrete connections between the neurons in your brain. These are very dynamic structures, something that wasn't realized until relatively recently. This is not just true in youngsters. This is true throughout your life, that these connections are more like handshakes, where a relationship forms between 2 neurons. They decide they like each other. They decide they like talking to each other. They make a deal, and they stay stuck together. But maybe not forever. And maybe it's possible to make new connections throughout your life, and that's certainly the case. So if you look into the brain, the pictures show now a very dynamic picture. Some of these connections are immature, like 2 fingers that are reaching out and maybe just starting to get to know each other. But if they decide to connect, if they're wiring together, they're firing together, they want to make a connection, they become physically different. They become bigger, the structure changes, and this becomes a part of your new brain today. So this happens all the time, throughout your life. And even this conversation that we're having tonight and the conversations you had yesterday are actually changing the physical structure of your brains. And that gives us great hope as we move through life in both injury and normal brain function. This image makes that point just one more time. It shows a movie looping around of some of these connections being made in a quite dazzling way. These little bumps that you can see on this nerve cell are connections being made with other nerve cells. They're changing all the time. They're being checked to see whether they need to be removed or strengthened. And in the circle is a rather remarkable event, the birth of a brand new connection that wasn't there before, where some other neuron has connected and formed a new nerve cell, a new connection. This happens throughout our lives. We can change this as well. Our activities, our conversations change our brains. Things we do can change the state of plasticity and make it more or less able to change. Exercise may be one example. This picture shows an example at the top of a normal piece of a neuron, and the bottom is one with many more connections, and that's because it's been treated with a molecule that gets released during exercise that causes increase in growth of these connections and makes the brain more able to receive new connections. Conversely, things work the other way. Things like chronic stress. A little bit of stress might be good for brain. Too much stress can cause this. On the right-hand side, there's a picture of a nerve cell where the connections are actually diminished, reduced in number by chronic stress, and this is in an area of the brain that controls emotion. So this structural change in the brain can change the control of emotions in the body at this microscopic level. So I think about this a lot, not just because it's part of my job, but because the picture on the left is my son, who's learning a lot right now, setting up these circuits. And the picture on the right is my dad, who taught me a lot throughout life. And I want to finish by sharing with you, I think, the third myth that I'd like to expose tonight. And that is something my father challenged me with when I was making the decision to go to graduate school. And I was trying to tell him that I wanted to be part of this adventure, part of this great adventure to try and understand how the complex brain worked. And he said, be careful. If you do that, if you look under the hood and see how it all works in bunches of neurons, maybe it will take away the mystery of what it is to be human. Maybe it's going to be a bad thing for your happiness. And I think I would like to say tonight on Brain Awareness Week that that's absolutely not the case. The more I and everyone else who looks into the brain studies it, I think you can't help but be dazzled, astonished even, of what it can really do. You can't help but be astonished that this real thing, it doesn't take away the magic to see it. It makes you a believer in the magic. If you can actually see what it is that connects you with your entire reality, with everything that you love and appreciate in the universe, is real, and you're in control of how it gets set up, and you're in control more than you think about how it dazzles you and is able to be maintained and adapt throughout your lifespan. So for me, that's very reassuring also, because as I'm moving ever closer to my father's age, it gives me hope that you can teach an old dog new tricks. Thank you.
Can I try it? I think try it. Well, Bill is absolutely correct. You can teach an old dog new tricks. Really happy for that. It may be a little harder, it may take a little longer, but it can be done. So let's just do a quick experiment. How many of you have learned something new as an adult? If you can raise your hand or snap your fingers. All right, that's what I thought. That was my hypothesis. How many of you have learned something new that perhaps someone said you could not learn? A lot of those as well. When you learn, as you learn a new sport, a new hobby, some of you have learned a new language. I'm hoping to work on that myself this summer. When you do that, your brain changes. There are actual changes in the physical structure of your brain and in the communication within this physical structure of your brain. And we can actually see this with neuroimaging. So I want to give you some specific examples of those changes. And we're going to talk about some tricks, we're going to talk about some language, and we're going to talk about some sounds. So let's talk about learning new tricks. This is an adult learning to juggle. When you ask an adult to engage in a fairly intensive training schedule so that they can learn to juggle, two things happen. One, they learn a new trick as an adult, encouragement. Two, their brain changes. And you're going to hear that actually a lot. You've already heard it a few times, you're going to hear it several times. I think you're going to walk out of here knowing that your brain can change. So I'm going to show you some very specific ways that your brain can change. Your neurons in the areas of your brain responsible for visual motion, they actually grow. They beef up a little bit. They need and they take more nutrients and more proteins, and they get stronger. And their connections to other parts of the brain that are responsible for holding on and handling the ball and throwing it, those connections get stronger and thicker and have higher density as well. If you ask older adults, age 65 and older, to do the same type of training schedule for the same period of time, overall we see less learning with that same schedule and less plasticity, but they are able to learn, and we do see plasticity. These changes in the brain are not restricted to, situations where you're just learning new motor skills. So I'm going to give you an example related to learning a second or third or fourth language as an adult as well. When you do that, we see those same changes in the structure, that beefing up of those neurons and their connection, in areas of your brain usually involved in storing semantic concepts and vocabulary. We also actually co-opt part of the brain that is not used for storing concepts or vocabulary and not used for naming. We co-opt that specifically for this new language that we're learning. We also see increases in the size of the neurons in areas that are responsible for detecting or perceiving new sounds or gestures that are associated with this new language. For example, if you're learning German, you have to learn the sound and ich. And if you're trying to learn that, that actually doesn't exist in the English phonetic inventory. Or if you're learning a new sign language, the British sign for X versus the American sign for X, you have to have a place to store those things and to perceive those things. And we see an increase in the neurons in those areas. We also see an increase in the density of neurons responsible for any new motor movements that are needed to produce those newly acquired sounds. So we quantify these changes in the actual density and integrity of these neurons, and we call these structural changes. We also are very interested in looking at how the communication between these different areas of the brain might change, the timing of that communication, the efficiency of that communication, and functional changes. And what we see with second, third, or fourth language learning is that these different areas in the brain that have increased in size, they're also changing in the way that they communicate with each other, with how they're lighting up and correlating with each other. And so you demonstrate both structural and functional changes. And actually, functional changes can happen without structural changes. You can see a change in the way that things are communicating without actually seeing huge or significant changes in the sizes of the neurons themselves. So experiential brain changes are not always good for you. So I'm going to give you one example. This is a spectrogram of a speech signal. And when you hear speech, there are certain areas in the brain that might light up in response to this signal. And when you're just hearing noise or something not as important as speech, this response is actually reduced. Now, when your spouse is talking to you, you're actually still supposed to respond in this way. For people who work in factories, airports, where they're exposed to loud, broad spectrum noise for most of their waking hours, this actually changes the brain in a negative way. They actually have a more difficult time discriminating the speech signal from noise. And what we see is that those areas that are supposed to light up in response to speech, they don't light up like they're supposed to in response to speech. And this is even though that their hearing thresholds are pretty much intact. So it's not an issue with their hearing, it's an issue with being able to tag that speech signal as being important because their brain has been inundated with so much noise, and it's changed your brain in a negative way. So these examples of juggling, of language learning, of noise exposure have involved a lot of repetitions or a lot of practice or a lot of exposure. And this leads us to some rules of changing your brain, or rules of what we call experience-dependent plasticity. And so the first rule is use it or lose it. So you guys are probably all familiar with that, but like a muscle, you gotta flex these neurons, or they're gonna be recruited to participate in another task, or they're gonna waste away. Use it a lot. A lot of repetitions, a lot of practice with the target behavior is required. What I like to call the Goldilocks rule, it can't be too easy what you're practicing, and it's gotta be challenging, but not too challenging so that it's not attainable. So it must be just right. The last one is relevance matters. Whatever behavior you are trying to change or develop, it needs to be important. It needs to be for some reward, or for survival, or for improved quality of life, or something like that. What I hope that these illustrations have shown you is this, is that you use your brain to direct your own experiences. Your brain changes because of experience. And in this way, your brain can change itself. So it's wonderful that we can actually use all of this knowledge that we have about experience-dependent plasticity to help a brain that has some damage. So before I talk and give you some examples of that, I want you to just imagine with me for a moment that your brain is an orchestra. Here's our orchestra pit and our different players in this orchestra game. Some of these orchestra members are specialized for trumpet playing, for flute playing, for percussion. But what they all do is that they work together in concert, if you will, to make this beautiful and provoking music. And in order to do this, what has to happen? The trumpets need to know when to come in, right? Cue the trumpets. The violins need to know when to get louder. Something needs to know when to get softer, and all the instruments need to know when it's their turn to cut off entirely. And this is very important when thinking about the brain and its functions. It's not always about being on all the time. It's not always about being loud all the time. Sometimes it's about turning down, and sometimes it's about turning off. Your brain actually adapts pretty quickly to a little bit of damage. For example, a couple of your violin players don't show up for the performance. So the rest of the orchestra can kind of pick up the slack. The show goes on, and you might not even know that anything happened and that somebody's about to get fired. So this is actually what happens when we have a little bit of damage in our brain, or when we might have progressive damage, and why we don't really see outward symptoms right away, because your brain does a really good job of compensating. It's a little bit different when you have a larger kind of surface area, larger real estate involved in this damage. That's more like your entire trumpet section not showing up for the performance. And I think we could all agree that that is a lot more obvious and a lot more difficult to compensate for. But your brain will try to compensate, and it does a pretty good job. It actually tries to get some neighboring neurons that might have some knowledge of this behavior that is lost. So if my trumpet players are gone, I might get some baritones, because they have some knowledge of how to play a trumpet or those parts. Or another part of the brain that's not usually involved might try to compensate a little bit by playing louder, so the strings are playing louder and louder, trying to cover up for the brass. It may work a little bit, but it is probably not the best solution. We can use our rules of experience-dependent plasticity and provide a lot of personally challenging, individualized, and relevant practice to recruit some of these neurons that are around this damaged area of the brain. We can also recruit neurons in areas of the brain that weren't really involved in the task before, but may be open to be recruited in a new network. And we can also use treatment activities to try to quiet down those parts of the brain that are really overcompensating and really not helping that much. And treatment, behavioral treatment, can do these things for us. The beautiful thing is that we're not Mark McGuire or Lance Armstrong or Olympic hopefuls. I mean, there may be some in the crowd, but we can actually use enhancers to make our brain do even more awesome things than it's already doing. And you have people in your community who are really aggressively investigating brain stimulation, specifically a technique called transcranial direct current stimulation. And what transcranial direct current stimulation can do is that just with a little bit of electrical current applied to the brain through the scalp, it can excite neuronal groups to participate. It can modulate them in an excitatory manner to participate and to be recruited into a new task. And it can also modulate them in an inhibitory manner so that maybe they will stop kind of interrupting in your progress. So I've seen neurorehabilitation work time and time again. It doesn't work for everyone, not every patient, and not always with really huge effects, but enough to make me believe that it works. And I want an example of a person who showed some pretty dramatic changes in a short period of time. We'll call him Harrison, because everyone says he looks like Harrison Ford. I met him when I was conducting a study back when I was a lot younger, And he was about a year out from his stroke. And the medical professionals that he had contact with had pretty much already convinced him that he was at the end of his recovery curve. They had pretty much plateaued. He had 18 words in his inventory, and he had a burning desire to say a whole lot more than that, and to say I love you to his wife, and to say his old catchphrase, life is good. He drove 2 hours a day, both ways, just to participate in this study. So what we did is we incorporated these principles of plasticity. He used spoken language to communicate, and he used it a lot. Tasks were challenging, but not too, and they were all behaviorally and personally relevant to him. At the end of this, he had 214 words. This was just after 2 weeks of intensive treatment. It was about 30 hours within 2 weeks. 214 words, and a huge smile on his face when he told his wife, I love you, and life is good, and many other things that he was saying as well, some that are not PG. He also left with a brain that was behaving in a different way. It looked different, and it communicated in a different way. So Harrison still continues to improve, and he wants to improve a lot more. He and I still keep in touch, he and his family and we still exchange holiday gifts. I usually send them something that says life is good, and they usually send me something that says believe. And this was the latest installment, because they said that our treatment made them believe again. He can and he will continue to improve. And you know why? Because plasticity is not the exception, it is the rule. Not only for typical brains, but also for damaged brains. So life is not perfect yet. His language is not fully restored, but life is indeed good.
I have the fortunate task of following those two to give my talk. I don't know, is everyone else's brain here totally changed and full? I don't know how much more change I can take here. I'm Davin Quinn. I'm going to talk with you about times when life is not so good. I'm a psychiatrist at University of New Mexico. People don't usually come to me saying that life is good. Usually they're saying the opposite. And one of the things that people wonder about is, can these brain principles, can these neuroplasticity principles be applied to our emotional lives, to our emotional problems? This is something that absolutely, 100%, they can be applied, and they do apply to our emotional lives and our problems. So that's what I'm going to be here trying to convince you of tonight. There are a few somewhat challenging ideas associated with that. Before we can accept that our emotional lives do follow these same rules, there are a few challenging ideas. So let me throw out the first one, the first controversial idea, which is that emotions live in the brain. Now that may not sound super controversial, but in fact, for most of human history, we've not believed that emotions live in the brain. We've very much thought that emotions live outside the brain. And so you can see here in this picture, which is from the 1500s, people in medieval times believed that our emotions were controlled by these four humors, these four fluids that ran through our blood vessels. And those are what controlled our emotions. You could be phlegmatic, you could be sanguine, you could be melancholic, you could be choleric, and the ratio of those humors is what determined how you felt. So even up to very modern times, even the 16th, 17th, 18th century, we very much thought that emotions were not something that happened in the brain. They're something that happened elsewhere in the body. It's ingrained in our very language, in our very vocabulary. So for instance, if I'm impressed with someone who's demonstrated a lot of courage, what do I say? I say, you know, she's got a lot of guts. As if emotions and courage come from the stomach. Or if someone's really choked up, really upset, you say choked up, it's as if it comes from the throat. right? Or if you say, geez, you've got to show some spine, right? Show some grit and determination, as if that comes from the back. So we're very much all about talking about emotions as if they come from outside the brain. But they very much come from inside the brain. And here's where they come from. This is the depiction of the limbic system. The limbic system is where emotions start in the brain. This was devised and determined by a neurologist from France named Paul Broca. Actually, his name is related to the speech area that Jessica was talking about, she showed many times. But he also determined where in the brain emotions come from. He called it the limbic system. The limbic system is very old. As you can see here, it's not on the outside of the brain. It's very much on the inside of the brain, very close to the center, close to the areas that control a lot of the automatic, unconscious, reflexive things that the central nervous system does. Its location close to the center makes it quite hard to study. But that said, the limbic system has been around for a very long time. Even in mice, their limbic system looks very similar to ours. All the same structures are there. The mice emotional system is the same as the human emotional system, whatever that says about it. But it's very hard to study, it's very deep, and perhaps that's why we don't know a whole lot about it yet, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of the limbic system and what it does with emotions. It can be helpful to conceptualize the limbic system as coming in between two other parts of the brain. This is a picture of the brain, a theoretical picture devised by another neuroanatomist, this time an American named Paul MacLean. He came up with this picture of the brain in 3 sections. And the first section is called the reptilian brain. That's the brain stem that Bill was talking about that controls all the unconscious stuff that you don't even think about. Heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, breathing, your reflexes. And then way up top is the mammalian cortex that handles all the higher order thinking, abstract thinking, problem-solving, planning. The limbic system lives in between those 2 areas. And so that gives us a suggestion of how to talk to the limbic system, that these are 2 doorways to go from the bottom up through the reptilian brain, or from the top down through the mammalian cortex. So let's talk about from the bottom up. To talk to the limbic system from the bottom up, you can engage in activities that really have a lot to do with automatic, unconscious things. So for instance, exercise affects the limbic system by coming from the bottom and getting your blood pressure up, getting your heart rate up. Rest also can have a good effect on the limbic system. Adjusting the temperature of the room can determine how your emotions may go. The weather that you're not thinking about, but it's absolutely affecting your mood. The nutrition and the food that you take in, you may not be sort of thinking about it once it goes down your mouth, but it's absolutely affecting your moods and your limbic system once you digest it. Sleep, your diurnal cycle, what are you doing during certain parts of the day? The immune system, we're just starting to learn a little bit about the immune system, but it can have a significant effect on your emotions. If you're increasing inflammation, if you're decreasing inflammation. And then finally, medications. Medications can also have an effect by working from the bottom up through the reptilian brain. What about from the top down? From the top down, you're communicating with the limbic system with things that mainly have to do with words, talking to yourself, planning things, visualizing things. So reading and writing, an extremely powerful way to access the limbic system. Paying attention, meditation, praying, focusing on something, focusing on anything will have an effect on your limbic system. And then engaging in pursuits, hobbies, making music, making art. These are extremely powerful ways of accessing our emotions. So we have these 2 doorways into the limbic system, from the top down and from the bottom up. And it's important to remember these. So we now know that, or you've accepted hopefully, that emotions live in the brain. Are we ready now to talk about how neuroplasticity affects these emotions. Well, not quite. And the reason why I say not quite is because you have to really sort of get behind this idea that emotions can actually be worked on the same way you work on speech and motor. So let's see if you're ready for it. I'm going to provide you an example. Do people know who this is? Messi. Lionel Messi, the most famous soccer player in the world, right? Who plays for FC Barcelona. If Lionel Messi broke his leg in a game, what would his coach say? His coach would say probably something like, "We need to get you to see a doctor right now. We need to get you to have an x-ray for your leg to see how bad it is. We need to get you pain medicine to reduce the inflammation. We need to get a healing started. We need to not put weight on your leg. We need to give you time to rest so that you can come back to play," right? There are probably a lot of soccer fans in here, I hope, who might understand this metaphor. I was wondering maybe I should put Peyton Manning up here, but, hopefully soccer will do. But what if Lionel Messi, instead of a broken leg, what if he had depression? What if he was so depressed, getting so depressed that he really didn't want to play soccer anymore? Have you ever heard of a professional sports player being put on the disabled list because they were depressed? No. What does that say? Does that say they never become depressed? Not really. What it means is that the coach probably isn't going to say, "We need to get you to see a doctor right away for that depression. We need to take an x-ray of your brain to see what's going on. We need to use medicines to help you heal faster and feel better. We need to not put stress on you so that you can recover. We need to give you time to rest so that you can come back." That would be a pretty unique coach to say something like that to a player who is feeling depressed. So you understand now that perhaps as a society we have a bit more difficult time talking about emotions in the same way that we talk about the rest of the brain and the rest of the body. Okay, so if you're with me on that, let's go to the next step, which is how do we use these neuroplastic principles that Jessica explained so well to work on our emotions? Well, luckily, psychotherapists are actually working on this right now. So let me give you the example of cognitive behavioral therapy. Have people here heard of cognitive behavioral therapy? Good. So it's probably the most studied and the most widely used psychotherapy in the world, and it operates on a very simple principle, as you see in this triangle, which is that your thoughts are connected to your feelings, and they're connected to your behaviors, which connect back to your thoughts, and that these connections exist not just in your sort of psychology, but actually in your brain, that these are actually neural connections between the neurons firing for your thoughts that lead to the neurons firing to trigger feelings, which then lead to the neurons that fire to act out behaviors. And the CBT therapist will analyze these very closely. What are the thoughts that you have precisely that lead to the way that you feel? What are the feelings that you have exactly? What are they called? And how do those lead to you then doing something or not doing something? And analyzing that over and over till we know exactly what are those relationships between your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. Once we know that, then the CBT therapist can say, all right, if that's what's leading to problems, let's come up with a solution. Let's come up with a counteractive thought. Let's come up with a different thought that you'll think of each time you have that anxious thought or the depressive thought. And then you practice that. You practice that thought into the ground until you become so good at that counteractive thought that it almost replaces the depressive thought. So that exemplifies the neuroplasticity rules perfectly, which is use it or lose it. You got to use it. Use those thoughts, those counteractive thoughts. Use them a lot so that you practice them. It's got to be specifically tailored to the depressive or anxious thought that you're having so that it can replace it, right? And let me give you one more example about this. I'm going to go ahead and tell you about a very difficult patient I had to treat. That was myself. And I had a problem getting to sleep one time. I don't know, has anyone here ever dealt with sort of poor sleep, insomnia? If you read the newspapers, it's extremely common, right? And it is extremely common. It happened to me, and I'm not ashamed to say it. So I was having insomnia. I tried the over-the-counter stuff. Didn't really work. And then what happened? I'm lying there awake at night, and I'm thinking, oh boy, here we go again. I'm just going to not get good sleep. I'm going to be tired the next day, going to feel miserable. And then worrying about it made it even harder to sleep, right? So there's this vicious cycle. So I came up with a counteractive thought. And the counteractive thought was this. So what? So what if I don't get sleep? So what? So what if I am tired all next day? I've been tired before. It's happened before. I'm still alive. So what if I feel miserable? I'll get through it. I've gotten through it before. And so I said, so what? Every time I felt anxious about falling asleep, I said, so what? So what? And I did it enough times that it actually became so natural that I didn't get anxious anymore when I didn't fall asleep. And guess what? It got easier to fall asleep. So I'm not saying that I fall asleep, easily every night, but at least it doesn't bother me as much as it used to. And that's really kind of the trick with CBT. So the great thing about CBT, because it's so widely studied, we're actually able to sort of see the changes in the brain that CBT does. So this is the picture of a brain of someone who, before, during, and after CBT. And the red areas mean the brain is active, hyperactive, and the blue areas mean that it's sort of cooled down and relaxed. So before CBT, up in the upper left-hand corner, there's the limbic system, active, on fire. And then over the course of CBT, 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks, 32 weeks, the limbic system quiets down. And the parts of the brain that are also related to worrying become more relaxed and more calm, the blue areas. And so you see CBT actually is causing the changes in the brain that we would expect based on what it's doing to your thoughts. Okay, so you're becoming an athlete at changing your thoughts when you use cognitive behavioral therapy. Well, that's all great. So now we're at the end of the road, right? We become experts at harnessing neuroplasticity to change our emotions. Is that it? Are we all done? Well, like in the movie Top Gun, he said, you're the best of the best. You're the top 1%. We can make it better. So this is where we get to use what Jessica was telling you about, non-invasive brain stimulation, to try and actually make neuroplasticity, make the changing of your brain happen faster, happen more efficiently, perhaps even happen to a greater degree. So this is transcranial direct current stimulation. 2 electrodes on your head, passing electrons from one side to the other, and what does it do? It causes neurons to be more or less likely to fire. This makes it quite useful if you pair it with an activity that you're trying to do. For instance, if you're trying to pay attention to something, if you're trying to meditate, if you're trying to do a rehabilitation exercise. If you pass electrons through the brain while you're trying to do it, the neurons become a little bit more likely to fire while you're doing this. And perhaps that will have an effect on the activity that you're doing, so that next time you do it, you can do it to a greater degree. So maybe cognitive behavioral therapy, instead of taking 32 weeks, will take 16 weeks. Maybe if you're depressed and you're on an antidepressant, instead of taking 2 months to work, it'll work in 2 weeks. Maybe if you're trying to recover motor function after a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, instead of getting a partial recovery, you can get closer and closer to full recovery. So that's one of the things that we're studying very actively at University of New Mexico Center for Brain Recovery and Repair, using non-invasive brain stimulation to try to enhance the benefits of cognitive or physical training. So that brings us to the end of our journey tonight, which is 3 parts. You heard Dr. Shuttleworth talk about neurons, their amazing plasticity, their ability to change, the handshakes that they make with each other, and the myths that he exploded about how the brain functions. You heard from Dr. Richardson, who talked about plasticity in the service of learning new skills and improving motor function. And hopefully I've convinced you that emotions live in the brain. They can behave according to the same neuroplasticity principles, and you can actually control your emotions. And so that really brings us to the end of the evening, and we now hopefully will leave you with 2 things going from here, which is number 1, hope. Hope that you actually can use these principles we talked to you about to control your lives, your brains, the thoughts and the feelings and the behaviors that you have. And then also excitement, the same excitement that we feel as we're studying these principles, and that we look forward to working together with you to advance and come up with new treatments. So thanks very much.
Need to turn the microphone on. Great.
But I'm not going home.
At this point, we invite people to, if you have questions,
So,
phone, and you can ask questions of our speakers.
so we are
If you have any questions they'd like to come up and ask, or I can bring a microphone.
Well, while we're waiting for the first question, let me ask you, you have 150 or so multidisciplinary people involved, two of your great scholars here. How do you all get together and take this information and make things better? What's the plan?
Well, the numbers you're referring to are not strictly the Center for Brain Recovery and Repair. That's a slightly smaller group. The larger group, the Brain and Behavioural Health Institute, is really trying to get at that point you're making. Most of the time, specialists in different parts of brain science are scattered across campus. And BBHI, Brain and Behavioural Health Institute, gives us a way to get together with events like this, but also other events that we have this week that really focus on building teams of people. Because patients with complex brain disorders need teams. They need people with different expertise in psychiatry, neurology, and neuroscience to all work on a patient as a whole, so they're not shuttled between all these different services. So that's the power of BBHI. So thank you.
Do we?
So this question is about brain health, and one of the things I've been reading about is that the health of your gut can influence the health of your brain, and I'm curious if what you have to say about that, if you've seen that in research or what your opinions are about that.
I think
Go ahead.
that there's actually a lot of very exciting work done on what's happening in the relationship between gut and brain. That's really exploded in the last couple of years, and I'm a believer, I think many others are too, that the data are strong. If you take animals that don't have well-colonized guts and give them different learning tasks, they learn differently. So it actually affects the structure and the ability of the brain to learn, and it's very likely that it affects things like emotions and other things as well. So it's direct communication between neurons that are actually within your gut, responding to what's happening there and transmitting that information back up into brain. So there's a very strong connection. I think we're really at the beginning of knowing which bacteria are good and which are bad, and there's no prescription yet for what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat. But be aware of it. If your emotions are really, or your behaviors are really modified, or your sleep's really modified, it can be a product of what you eat and what's happening deep inside your bowels.
And I would just sort of add to that one more thing, which is that the relationship between the gut and the brain is a bi-directional relationship, meaning that the gut and what is in it and is passing through it can influence what happens in the brain, and vice versa, what occurs in the brain can also have a significant influence on the gut and how it operates, and it can become very difficult to sort of tease out which direction it's going at any particular time, but being mindful of that there's a bi-directional relationship, it's a two-way street between those two organs, I think is also really important.
So tonight you pretty well rolled TDCS out of the closet. It's quite the debutante now. To build one of these boxes, a fourth grader can do it with $15 at Radio Shack and a couple hours with a solder pencil. And I imagine by the end of the week, we're going to have people hanging out a shingle saying, I'm a TDCS therapist, and they'll plug you into their box. It'll be like going down to the Scientology, I wonder if you might want to say a few words about how you want this message received at the consumer end of the pipeline. Thanks.
Yes, so I work a lot with people who are trying to establish safety limits and to try to raise awareness of actually where we are with TDCS research right now. So you're absolutely right. And every convention I've gone to, there's been like the gaming community too, they have their own separate community, and I'm not allowed in because they're trying to use it to improve their gaming, and they have their own devices. There's several companies that are already producing that you can very easily buy it. The thing that I want to caution you about is that we're still learning so much about dose and response. And so what we try to make sure that our message is consistently is that we still don't know exactly how the brain responds in each situation. The most information that we have is when it's applied to the motor cortex. It's the most consistent information that we have to change the firing of the neurons in the motor cortex. When you start getting into cognitive and linguistic behaviors and other behaviors, things are less clearly defined, and that's part of the big work right now. We don't have the answers. And so we can't really tell you at this point, yeah, go do it, no problem. If you put this one here and add it to this, then this is what you'll get. That's not the case, because also in the case of a damaged brain, the damaged brain doesn't always respond in the way that you think that you would expect a normal brain to. So maybe when we're giving something to try to excite, that the damaged brain, it might actually inhibit. And so we're really uncovering all of those dose-response relationships right now. And what I would want the message to be is to not take it into your own hands right now, to help us do this research, to volunteer for these studies, and to just be a little patient before this is something that you're building. Is Radio Shack still open? I don't see them anymore. But to not do that, to consult the professionals, to consult the safety limits, and to wait for us to reveal some more dose-response relationship, because you can change your brain in the way that you don't want it to change. I mean, because I showed you some examples. Change is not always good for the brain, and there are other examples from amputees with maladaptive plasticity, even with musicians with dystonia with maladaptive plasticity, and so we need to learn a lot more about that.
The IQ tests that we took when we were younger, the IQ that we have when we're born, that can be changed drastically as we grow?
I mean, we are, am I fielding that one? I don't know exactly about static intelligence, because I really feel that's more of a function of the tests that we're taking. I think it's pretty limited in what it can tell us. We do know that in certain montages and some dose response situations, or even without brain stimulation, even with just working on it, that you can increase by points, you can improve your cognitive abilities. And also, if you think more about your fluid intelligence, maybe your learning potential to learn new things, you can change that as well. I think there probably are certain things that are set up, but I don't think that they're not changeable, because that would make sense to me with what we know about how the brain can change.
You talked about using outside electrical stimuli to increase the effectiveness of CBT. Have you considered, or are there any studies involving, for example, powerful magnetic fields to do the same kind of thing?
Sure. So I can speak about some of the other types of brain stimulation therapies that are out there. You mentioned magnets, so there's something called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It uses magnetic pulses instead of electrical electrodes on the scalp. It actually uses a magnet to induce electrical changes in the brain, and that has been shown to have a robust antidepressant response. So it can work in concert with psychotherapy like CBT that you're doing. There are less studied forms of magnetic stimulation in which they use different kinds of fields surrounding the brain in order to create electrical changes in the brain. Those are much less studied, but there are some groups in the United States that are working on that. So it can be an adjunct to psychotherapy, absolutely. Whether you do it at the exact same time, that's a very interesting question, because you sort of, for certain kinds of therapies, you have to remain quite still, and others you can move around a little bit more. But whenever you're in a magnet, there's always sort of you generally have to remain pretty still, and then it becomes a little bit difficult to kind of do things at the same time. So.
He had a follow-up. What was that?
Are they allowed to do follow-up? All right, one follow-up.
So you're talking about having to remain still inside a magnetic field. I think you're more thinking about things like MRI machines and things like that, where you have to remain still for imaging purposes. But just from a therapy purpose, you can create a magnetic pulse around a person without having them just be still. You can be in a room around a superconductor, things like that. But there's just basic studies, nothing major regarding that. Is that something that maybe we should look into?
I think it absolutely is a rich area for research. And I think the idea that you talked about, where there's a room with sort of a magnetic field and you go into and out of it, is quite interesting. I'm not aware of that being studied. I'm usually aware of sort of smaller devices. So
Let me ask you this question, because you don't really know when you do this exactly what you're doing. I mean, no, in other words, there's not in other words, if you think about what we have to do with medication, what you're doing is you're giving medication, or the medication which has an effect on brain function. And so the question is are there any sequelae from doing this? Is there any long-term follow-up that if you get too much magnetism or too much stimulation that it has some sequelae? Or is there a possibility that, like an antidepressant, will have a side effect that is unwanted? Is there something about this drug that could be?
do you want to speak to the first
With TDCS, it's a lot different from TMS. It's very easy to use. The side effects are mostly sensations to the scalp. Every now and again, someone might get a migraine or something, but those are very low reports of that. In terms of negative effects, again, that's where we are right now, looking at dose response. And so we are trying to follow up whenever you try to excite areas and when you also try to inhibit areas or modulate them in that direction. And we're trying to actually encourage our research community to follow them up longer. In speech and language, the longest follow-up has been 3 weeks. And it's actually shown gains that were maintained at 3 weeks. There haven't really been a whole lot of studies that have shown reductions, unless the study was specifically trying to target reductions to prove, that inhibition occurred. And usually still the follow-up is maybe hours, a couple of days, maybe a week. So overall, we're not thinking with the investigations that we've done now that we're looking at with the current dose and with the current schedule of treatment, that we're looking at really, really long-term changes, whether they be good or bad. But the reason is because we're being so careful to make sure that we're controlling it so much so that we're not being irresponsible and making these really long-term changes without really knowing what we're doing first.
So I'll just tell you about a question that another doctor asked me when I told them about this transcranial direct current stimulation and putting electrodes on the head and passing electricity through the brain. They said, "Is that going to cause a brain tumor?" And I said, "I really, really don't think so." But the long-term studies looking at people receiving this kind of brain stimulation over years and years and years have not been done. Now, what we know is that there have been decades of people who have received much more powerful electrical stimulation to the brain, and they have not developed brain tumors as a result. So I feel fairly confident in saying that I don't think TDCS is going to cause things like brain tumors. But you're absolutely right. It is like a medicine. It is dosed like a medicine. It is a medical treatment and should be viewed as such, and that you should not do this kind of thing at home, kids. Right. So consult a professional.
Do this at home.
Yeah, right.
According to popular myth, teenagers are always moody, so do different ages kind of generally affect the brain in kind of emotions and how they think?
That's a good question.
I'm glad you said that was a myth. That's very interesting. So is that myth true? I would say that being a teenager is a really difficult time. I remember it being a really difficult time for me, and you've got all sorts of things happening at that age. So number one, puberty's happening, which brings with it all kinds of hormones and hormonal changes, and that's undeniable that affects how you feel emotionally and physically. It's also the case that because of that, you probably develop a different relationship with the people that you're living with, your parents and people who are taking care of you, right? And that effect on your relationships with the people you live with can have a significant effect on your mood. It's also the case that, at school becomes a much different thing than in elementary school. You go into middle school. And so there's so many things going on that I think absolutely affect mood at that time in your life, when you're sort of in your teens, that, it absolutely is going on at so many levels. So, our moodiness, what is that? You have moods? Like, yeah, sure, we all have moods. But it's a very intense time, without a doubt.
Can I add one comment to that? Because it's a great question. The brain structurally changes a lot throughout our lives, and adolescence is a very interesting period for brain development. So while you've got most of your circuits pretty much almost set up, the amount of myelination is still dramatically increasing. That's a process where your neurons and your pathways between parts of the brain are wrapped in an insulator, which makes the message go much more quickly between parts of the brain. And that's still happening in the teenage brain, right up until your early 20s. So communication between parts of the brain that make decisions about is this a good idea or a bad idea aren't necessarily connected so well with the rest of your brain, and you've got a chance to set that up and make that how you want it. And that's one of the challenges and the exciting things about setting up a brain. And that's still happening in teenage years.
Hi, I'm here with the Epilepsy Support and Education Services. Huh? Oh, sorry, is that better?
Yeah.
I'm here with the Epilepsy and Education Services, and I really like what you had to say about emotions. And one thing that's really important to us is having support, because we found that stress and emotions really do affect your seizures. And I wanted to know if you could elaborate on that, because I think it's something that people don't acknowledge enough. It's not just other events,
Very good question.
Great. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And one of the things that I didn't suggest that the coach of Lionel Messi would say when he broke his leg was, why don't you use some crutches, right? And so of course, when someone has an emotional problem or emotional difficulty, having the crutches there that will help you take the weight off and get you through, help you do the things that you need to do is super important. So supports, the epilepsy patients that I see in my clinic benefit hugely from a supportive family or supportive caretakers or supportive friends coming to the appointments with them, helping them with their medicines, helping them get services, helping them to afford their treatments. So I can't say enough about that. And perhaps the most important people in my clinic are not the doctors, but it's the nurses and the social workers who help my patients get those things. And so Jessica, I'm sure you could probably elaborate on that too.
Yeah, well, a lot of the studies that we do are actually related to quality of life, actually of the person who has the brain injury, but also the caregivers, and how there's so many interactions between the activities, social isolation, social networks, impairment levels, and stress, caregiver strain. And actually, one of it came out recently that caregiver strain is a huge risk factor for stroke. And so we're talking to people to try to incorporate that more into your assessment, is not just thinking about the patient in front of you, but thinking about their circle, because they're the next candidates for someone who can be sitting in front of you as a patient. I think also that relates very directly to Bill's slide where he showed physical structure, physical differences in the neuron in response to chronic stress. And when you have a change in the neuron's architecture because of stress, this is changing how signals are being sent and basically the electrical activity in your brain. And seizures are related to electrical activity. So I don't know of a study that's like looking at that directly, but it makes sense to me because you're talking about the same circuit.
what I was talking about, was how the chemical impulses, the stress literally in your brain causes the seizure. It's not even really, you can have a lot of the support is necessary because it's the chemical imbalances and the electrons not firing correctly because of the stress in your life, that can cause seizures sometimes.
Thanks. I think we'll take one more question and then we'll end. Why don't you go ahead?
Two more. Two more.
Please.
They were both at the mic.
Okay. One of the current big buzzwords in any form of mental health therapy is mindfulness. And how does doing that tie in with plasticity? Is it proven to help change how the brain works and how everything is connected and reduce stressors and change bad thoughts in any way? Because I'm just going to say flat out, I have a lot of mental health problems and CBT has not proven all that helpful for me. So it's kind of hard to find people willing to try and help because everybody is doing that right now. And if it's everybody's focusing on it, what is it there for people who aren't finding success?
That's a very good question. So the issue is, what does mindfulness do from a physiologic standpoint? And does it have anything comparable to what you've been talking about tonight?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'll give you my take on that. When I think of mindfulness, I think of what's called non-judgmental mindfulness, as in thoughts come into your brain and you observe them, you identify them, you see what they are, and you don't judge them at that time. That not judging part can be really, really hard, I found. When I've tried to be non-judgmental about my own thoughts, that is super hard. I really want to judge them severely when they come in. So practicing that is actually sort of it's a practice-based kind of thing. And mindfulness involves a lot of sort of doing it over and over and trying to be non-judgmental. And so I absolutely think that it applies to the same rules apply to mindfulness and non-judgmental mindfulness as they do to the other things that we talked about. And it will allow some parts of the brain to relax, allow some parts of the brain to not be so intense, maybe allow some to reactivate. So I think it's the exact same kind of process, but in a different sort of package, so to speak.
Great. Well,
good answer.
Any other comments? Well, thank you. This was extraordinary. I think.
Can we have one more?
You have one more? Okay.
Thank you.
We don't want to leave anybody out. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Many people are using the program Lumosity. I'd like to hear what you know about its effectiveness, and it has been quite controversial.
I can make one comment about it. I know the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, is basically sending that program into bankruptcy because they found that their claims were not supported by evidence and that were gathered in ways that weren't legit. So that program is probably going to go away. But it doesn't mean that plasticity is wrong. So the catchphrase for all the TV commercials about luminosity was, brain plasticity science, here's some tricks to make it work. Brain plasticity is true. The tricks that they're packaging and selling may not be true, but it doesn't mean plasticity is not true. So there are some very good evidence that doing things that Jessica talked about that challenge the brain throughout your lifespan are good for it and aren't just for the tasks. I mean, doing Sudoku puzzles doesn't just make you good at Sudoku. It actually gets parts of your brain working that is good for it for other things. So maybe luminosity didn't make it, but the whole principle is probably solid. And use it or lose it, and exercise and challenge the brain with things like new languages late in life are tremendously good for stimulating large areas of brain. Sort of like the TV commercials for luminosity, but are probably real.
Thank you. And I think just really quickly to transition, that it's a lesson for science because probably a lot of things are really good, but if you don't cross your T's and dot your I's in your science to make sure that you have non-biased observations and assessments, and that you're doing the things that you're supposed to, so that at the end of the day you can put it out and have these really good effects that are non-biased, then it could go forward. So it's really set science back a little bit, but it's really teaching a lesson that, come on, let's do it the right way. Let's have good fidelity of the science, and that way we can keep the field moving forward.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So I would like to know what studies you have done that have shown you the changes in the brain with somebody that has PTSD, and being a less than 20-something, I do believe in teaching an old dog new tricks. What things do you use to help someone and to treat someone? And can you tell me, if someone has PTSD, is there a point that they reach where they are not suffering with it, where they are actually past a point where that is impacting their lives daily?
Sure. So we are doing studies on PTSD, imaging the brain in people with PTSD compared to not. I think there are several studies that are about to get going looking at that. And so PTSD, it involves a lot of things. There's memories of trauma. There's the hyperactivity of your sympathetic nervous system. There's the cognitive sort of problems that you get from being so anxious. And then there's, of course, the depression from having your life sort of derailed. And so there's so many aspects of it. And, trying to, each person sort of finds their path through their traumatic experience. And I think it's probably like a whole, day-long conference to talk about these kinds of things. But PTSD, I mean, can someone sort of get to the point where they're not suffering? I mean, absolutely. Trauma is something that happened to an individual and it changed them. And it changes in the brain, changes in the body, changes in their sense of themselves. If the change happened, my belief is that more changes can happen to counteract that. And so, I absolutely believe in sort of the plasticity of the brain, the flexibility of the spirit, and of the psyche to be able to sort of come back from that trauma. But it can be a very complicated journey. Yeah.
We'd like to thank the filmographers, CABQ, for Albuquerque. Thank you very much for filming this evening.